Greetings everyone, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be how did actual Jewish translators translate Alma? This is going to be a finish-up video of the previous one I did, and I'll try to get to the points very quickly. So when you look at the actual ancient Hebrew text that deals with this issue that we were mentioning before of Yeshayahu 7:14, or in English you would say Isaiah 7:14. Now the question again that I was addressing in the previous video is whether or not it's correct to translate Alma or Alma as a virgin versus young girl. So here you see the Aleppo Codex, and it has the particular text we're talking about. And here's the statement that I mentioned, Hine ho Alma, which correctly translated from ancient Hebrew to English would be like here, the young girl, where Christians try to translate it as the virgin. And I showed in the previous video that there are Christians who try to kind of like bend themselves backwards by going and saying, okay, well, if you take the Hebrew text and translate it into Greek, the translators of Greek, use the word virgin. But again, as I mentioned in the previous video, Greek translations are not acceptable in the Jewish community. And in fact, those translations that are used by most Christians to defend this point are not even Jewish translations, meaning that Jews did not make those translations, but instead Christians did. Now, in order to prove this point, what I'll do is I'll go and look at a Jewish translation of this text into Aramaic to see exactly how the translation is made. The translation I'm going with is the one that was made by a man by the name of Yonatan ben Oziel. He was a Jewish person who lived, during the time of Hillel the Elder, which is a little bit over 2,000 years ago. And essentially, he had information that came from the last prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So he was, basically, receiving information from their time. That's the tradition that we have as Jews. So his translation would also be about 2,000 years old in terms of its information and content. So then when addressing this, when you look at the text as it says in the Hebrew text, Hine ho Alma, how did he translate it into Aramaic? So in what's called the Targum Yonatan, he wrote the following, which you see here at the bottom going from right to left. B'chen yiten Adonai hu lachon, although ho ul lamdo ma'addio, uthlid bar v'tikoreh sheme Immanuel. So translating this, basically it's essentially the same thing as what the Hebrew says, but when you look at exactly how he translated it, the parts we want to talk about, because he was saying that this is the word of Hashem, that Hashem basically said this is the sign that's going to be given, that this young girl, will basically give birth to a son, and the son will be called Emmanuel. So essentially, the reason why we know that this is young girl is, first of all, the words that are used here. If you look in the green, otho, and then the blue, ho, ulamto, essentially means like the young girl. So the red part is the part alma, but in Aramaic, so it's ulamto. So that essentially means like, we're talking about a particular young girl. Now, if the translator here had thought that, this is supposed to be like a virgin, specifically a virgin, in order to identify it, he would have translated as batulto. But he didn't translate it as batulto, he translated it as ulamto. So again, when it uses the word in blue that you see ho, this means this. So he's pointing at something very specific. So another way to look at it would be the following. The translation would be then, the young girl, or this young girl, even this young girl here. And the reason, of course, being that these words together, when you have otho, ho, ulamto, essentially would be like saying this girl right here. So he's not talking about some, person that's far, several hundred years in the future. Because again, as we mentioned in the previous video, the sign that was given wouldn't have meant anything to anyone if it's several hundred years in the future. But he's being very specific, and this is the Aramaic translations, meaning that when a Jewish person translated from the Hebrew to the Aramaic, he essentially used the same three-letter root that we talked about in the last video to basically describe the word, where if he really meant to say that this was like a virgin girl, he would have translated this as batulto, because batulto means virgin 100% across the board. Ulamto basically means a young girl with no knowledge or concern about what her history is, marriage-wise or otherwise. Now, in order to prove this point out, One of the things I did was I looked at and said to myself, okay, well, what are the Syrian, Christians, for example? How did they translate this when they wrote Matthew, when they, had their text of Matthew? Because there are some Assyrian Christians who claim that the New Testament, as they have it, for example, is the most ancient and authentic and authoritative one, where there are some people who say that theirs is just simply a translation of a Greek text that used to exist. So if you look at their version of Matthew, again, this is the Assyrian, this is the Peshitta, the Aramaic text that was basically the New Testament of the Church of the East. They have the following here when it comes to Matthew. And essentially what they have here is Batulto. Remember I mentioned earlier that Batulto means like virgin all the time? So that means that instead of translating it the way that a Jewish person did, the Assyrian Christians essentially, put, in Matthew that the text was saying Batulto. Now again, here's what's important, is that during the time that the New Testament describes in Matthew, Jews in that area would have been speaking Aramaic. Which is interesting, the fact that most surviving New Testaments that are considered accurate are in Greek, which is really strange when you really think about it, that none of the ancient, Hebrew texts, if Matthew was ever written in Hebrew, it didn't survive. If it was ever written in Aramaic, it didn't survive. And if this is an Aramaic text that is the most accurate Aramaic text of, Matthew, for example, the fact that Batulta is written here means that the person is basically saying that, the text was changed. And I'll show you why in just a second. So, looking at a comparison between an Aramaic Jewish translation versus an Aramaic Christian translation, we find something very interesting in this area. The left side, of course, is the Jewish translation, where you basically have in the Jewish Aramaic from Targum Yonatan ben Uziel, Otho ho ulamto, which, if you go from Hebrew to Aramaic, it has an agreement between the fact that what's supposed to be there is the young girl, meaning Alma, which is on the left of the bottom, is equal to Otho ho ulamto, essentially meaning this young girl right here. So the prophet, is being very specific, and the Targum, the translation from the Jewish side of things, is consistent with that. But if you look at a Christian translation, meaning that if you take the Christian Aramaic translation that we saw earlier from the Peshitta, which is the Assyrian Christian, Church of the East, text, which they claim to be an original in some cases, and also there's some scholars who claim that it's actually a translation of the Greek. They have the fact that in Matthew they have the word patulto as the rendering of what was being told, that to as a claim to say that Matthew was writing patulto rather than as meaning to be virgin, meaning that specifically in the text, this claim is being made that what is meant by the prophet was batulto, which means in Aramaic a virgin. But that point makes something a very interesting point, that the Christian text changes the meaning so that it doesn't mean the young girl anymore. It fits to their ideology of like being the virgin. In reality, these two are not equal. Because again, in ancient Hebrew, the word batula, which is how batulta was, would have been rendered in ancient Hebrew, was available. So if the prophet meant that, he would have written that. And you notice Jewish translations don't claim that the word Alma is understood to be batulta. Because again, we understand that ancient Hebrew had the word, and the word was accessible to be able to be used, if that's what the meaning was really supposed to be. Especially if the idea is to take away any doubt of what is supposed to be there. So we see a very stark contrast here, where the Jewish translations of the text of Isaiah, follow the same pattern as the Hebrew does, and says, Otho ho ulamto, as its translation of Alma, where the Christian one, like, puts in batulta as a translation for Alma, when they're not equal. Now, here's what's also interesting. If you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls online, there's a particular site that has like where you can look online and actually see, one of I think it's pretty much at this point the oldest version of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah. And if you look in like the part about chapter 7, verse 14, the person who translated this, whose name is listed as Peter Flint from Trinity Western University in Canada, and Professor Eugene Ulrich of University of Notre Dame, you look here and you see that they translated it the following. They say, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman has conceived and is bearing a son, and his name is Emmanuel. So they translated it as young woman. And again, these are not, I think from looking at their names, I don't get the impression that these people are, two people are Jewish, but they correctly translated it as Alma as young woman rather than virgin here. And that's right there. So as you can see, this isn't just us Jews making things up. There's Christian commentators who have come forward and admit that really it's supposed to be Alma, and it means basically a young woman, not a virgin. So in summary, what you have a situation where again I've shown in two videos that aren't really that long what the real situation is based on ancient Hebrew rather than pulling out Greek texts that weren't translated by Jews, were not the product of Jews, and using texts from the Jewish perspective. So essentially using the Hebrew Tanakh, the Hebrew language, and Jewish translations, it's clearly defined that Alma or Alma is correctly translated as young girl, and Alma would be translated as the young girl. So this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care. Bye.